So how did I become interested in evolutionary psychology? So, I kind of grew up with a biologist in the house, so, the basic principles of evolutionary psychology were certainly something that, even though I never took any courses when I was an undergraduate or a graduate student, I accepted the basic premise that, of course, we evolved in response to whatever the enduring circumstances that our ancestors faced. I don't think I really got personally interested in applying it in my own work until, I don't know, it was sometime in the 1990s. I'd been doing some work on prejudice and stereotypes, and I don't remember what precipitated it exactly, but I do remember, actually. I'd been doing some work on prejudice and stereotypes, and particularly about stereotypes as the kind of beliefs that not only do we hold in our head, but that are culturally shared within a population. That some stereotypes are norms. Everybody holds the same stereotype, and those are the stereotypes that actually are problematic because they're shared widely. And so I got interested in thinking about, I realize this is a long roundabout way of answering your question. And I'm deliberately bringing up the business about norms, so that's going to tie into some stuff that we're going to talk about later. So I was interested in, how and why it is that some stereotypes aren't just cognitive structures in my own head, but become and remain normative parts of the way that people in general think within a population, which started making me think about cultural evolutionary processes and how certain norms and practices within a culture come to be widely held, why and how it is that some of those things change over time, and so there was a lot of work on cultural evolution that used the basic principles of evolutionary biology, but applied it in this different context, thinking about the selection of beliefs or rituals or patterns of behavior, and how they might change over time. I started applying some of that to the work I was doing on stereotypes. So I was interested in, I was thinking about evolutionary processes as they applied in that context in psychology, and then one thing led to another. I guess that I was, I started thinking about, well, actually, let's think about not just evolution as a metaphor for cultural change over time, but let's think about how evolutionary processes really might have crafted our mind in certain ways over the course of our long history of and our long ancestors' history, even before we were human beings, and how our mind might have evolved in such a way that we might be especially likely to gravitate toward holding certain kinds of stereotypes of certain kinds of groups, having certain kinds of prejudicial responses to certain kind of groups, and so that was really how it all started for me. I think, I had these. I realized that was a long story. The short story is the basic ideas were banging around in my head, and I started realizing that there are some kind of interesting implications for how people think about other people and other groups of people. So here's I think one of my favorite examples of how the principles of evolutionary psychology can be applied to the study of stereotypes and prejudice, and it ties into work that people, including myself, but not just me, other people too. It applies to work that folks have done on what is sometimes called the behavioral immune system, which really captures the idea that a lot of the ways that our mind evolved has to do with how certain ways of thinking and acting in social interactions serve as kind of a prophylactic defense against the threat of infection by infectious diseases. Diseases pose a threat to health, a huge threat, and they did for a really long time throughout human evolutionary history. Uh, we know this for a lot of reasons, but one of the best reasons we know it is because we have this really sophisticated defense system against the things that cause infections. Our immune system, which is which works, is kind of kicked into action when those bugs, those bacteria, those viruses, whatever, get inside our body. And but there are certain costs to that immune system when it actually is engaged, which in such a way that, while it's great to have an immune system, it's even better if I never really have to use it. And that's where the behavioral immune system comes into play. The behavioral immune system is kind of like preventative medicine. I engage in certain kinds of behaviors that will minimize the likelihood that I'll come into contact with germs and infectious agents in the first place. And there's a lot of different ways that it operates, or a lot of different manifestations it has for our interactions with our environment, including our interactions with other people, that can minimize the likelihood of coming in, or throughout human evolutionary history, our likelihood of minimized our likelihood of coming into contact with infectious things. So one example of that ties into stereotypes and prejudice, and it was one of the first things that I was doing, has to do with our tendency to be kind of freaked out by people who seem foreign to us in some way. This xenophobic response to folks who just seem different. And there's several reasons why this might be the behavioral immune system and the threat of disease ain't the only reason why we tend to have xenophobic responses. We know that there's a lot of reasons why, but research shows that when people feel that they're threatened by disease, it kind of exaggerates these xenophobic responses. There's a lot of reasons why. So why is it that folks who are different from us might have posed some sort of threat? And I think for me, the most compelling reason is because those folks do things differently than we do. They have potentially different ways of preparing food, or different norms of interacting, and different norms of public hygiene or whatever. And there's a lot of folks who have made the argument that throughout a large chunk of our human evolutionary history, the way that we do things, the way that we as a culture do things, our cultural rituals, our cultural norms and so forth, actually help as a buffer against the spread of diseases. We prepare food in a certain way. We have certain norms of public hygiene. We defecate over here, not over there by our water source. And so people who comply with those norms, well, that's good. It helps keep those diseases at bay. It helps limit the spread. People who violate those norms, people actually do defecate over there by our water source. They pose, a health risk to themselves and to others. So, because of that, people have argued that a lot of norms, a lot of cultural rituals, a lot of just ways that we habitually do things serve as this buffer against the threat of disease, and that may contribute to this xenophobic response that we have against people who seem like they might potentially do things differently. So one example of research that shows this relationship between the perceived threat of disease and xenophobic responses is a study that a student of mine did, in which people were presented with a task in which these were all students in Canada who are our participants. They were presented with a task to assess their attitudes regarding immigrants from a variety of different non-Canadian countries. And I won't get into the details of the task, it's not all that important, other than we had a measure that was measuring the extent to which people were responding more negatively to more subjectively foreign immigrants rather than more familiar immigrants. So they're all immigrants, they're all folks from other countries, but some immigrants are, they're kind of just like us. And others are like, they seem more different and weird in some way. So we were able to get a measure of the extent to which people had a more xenophobic response to more culturally different kinds of folks. But before we actually assessed that task, we presented people with a little slideshow which was designed to activate certain kinds of worries about certain kinds of threats. In one of the conditions, people were presented with a slideshow that kind of activated worries about various ways of getting injured or hurt or even dying as a result of various kinds of accidents. That was a control condition. The other condition, which we compared it to, was a condition where we presented people with pictures and descriptions of things that made them more aware of the threat of infectious diseases. And what we found was that compared to that, accidents that might kill you control condition, in the condition where we activated a concern with the threat of infectious diseases, people had a relatively more xenophobic response to these immigrants from unfamiliar places. Another example of research on xenophobia that kind of fits into this, I like a lot. This is Carlos Navarrete's work with Dan Fessler. Work that shows that women in the first trimester of pregnancy, at a time when their own immune systems are temporarily suppressed, tend to have a more xenophobic response to outsiders than women in later stages of pregnancy when their immune system isn't suppressed anymore. So the finding is, under conditions in which these women literally are more susceptible to infectious diseases, they had more xenophobic and more ethnocentric responses. And I'm going to make a little pivot from the study of prejudice to something that has more to do with the power of norms. Okay. So are there other effects that the behavioral immune system might have that are interesting and not obvious? Yeah, and relevant to this whole business about being kind of spooked by people who might violate norms. There's a lot of studies now that show that when diseases do pose more of a threat, or if people simply kind of are more worried about the threat posed by diseases, they tend to be more likely to conform with cultural norms. They tend to be more keen to have other people conform to cultural norms. They tend to respond more harshly to folks who violate norms. They judge norm violations to be more morally wrong. And this shows up at a lot of different levels of analysis. So for instance, there's my students and I have done experiments that use a manipulation similar to the one that I told you about before, where people are we use a manipulation that makes people temporarily worried about the threat of infectious diseases. Compare it to a condition in which a different manipulation is used to make people temporarily more kind of concerned about other kinds of threats. And we find that in the condition in which people are more concerned about the threat of infectious diseases, they are in fact more likely to conform to what they perceive to be majority opinion. And we find that they're more likely to want other people to conform as well. And so that's one level of analysis. There's this other line of work that compares people in different countries around the world. And different countries around the world have historically had greater or less prevalence of infectious diseases. And across a bunch of different studies, using a bunch of different measures, the results show that in countries where diseases have historically been more prevalent, people are more likely to conform to majority opinion. They're more keen to want other people in their culture to conform, to be more obedient to authority. this research shows that in these countries where diseases have been more prevalent, governments tend to have more authoritarian policies, and in general, there's this relationship that suggests that the threat of disease is associated with a greater priority on doing things the way that other people do things, and doing things the way that we've always done things. So what's a scientific finding that reveals something deep and profound about human nature? There's a famous finding in psychology on obedience to authority, which I think does that. And it does it for reasons that go way beyond simply obedience to authority. This is some classic work done in the 1960s by Stanley Milgram. And most people have run into this. If they've taken an introductory psychology class, they've run into Milgram's findings. People have heard about it, even if they've never taken a psychology class, because it's part of the cultural discourse of human nature. And I've always felt that the way it's presented in psychology textbooks barely scratches the surface of why it actually is such a profound finding. So the basic idea is, so here's the setup. Milgram brought people into a lab, and they thought they were going to be participating in a study on learning. And they and some other participant in the study were supposedly randomly assigned to one of these two roles, the teacher and the learner. And it turns out that the other participant wasn't really a participant. They were a confederate of the experimenter. And so that person, the confederate of the experimenter, was always assigned to the role of the learner, and the actual participant was assigned to the role of the teacher. And because the nature of this supposed learning study involved the effects of punishment on learning, the teacher, the real participant, was supposed to punish the learner every time they got something wrong in this learning task. And the way they administered the punishment was by shocking them with an electric shock. And the shocks became increasingly more powerful every single time. So the first time the learner got something wrong, they got a mild shock. The next time they got something wrong, they got a slightly stronger shock, and so forth. And the way it was all set up, it was made to make it kind of clear that, these shocks, once they got to a certain point, were pretty darn painful. And so I should also say, just in case people don't know this, that the learner was never actually getting shocked. That was all a ruse. So the whole thing was a ruse, and what Milgram was really interested in doing was seeing how participants responded when the apparent shocks that they were giving were being perceived as painful by the learner, and how they then also responded when the person who is playing the role of the experimenter was instructing participants to keep giving shocks, even when, as they inevitably all did, even when they objected and said things like, hey, this guy seems in pain, maybe we should stop. So, what the guy was doing in the other room varied across different experiments, but in kind of a key version of the experiment, there was a certain point after a certain number of shocks, as they were getting increasingly strong, where the guy in the other room was saying things like, oh, and he was yelling out in pain, and this was always the point at which the participants would look to the experimenter and say, the guy's in pain, maybe I should stop. And the experimenter, who was following a very careful, rigorous script, would always be instructing them to continue, saying, please continue, the experiment demands that you continue, and so forth, essentially giving them orders, just verbal orders, nothing more, verbal orders to keep delivering those painful shocks. And as they kept doing this, then the guy who was getting the shocks was, shouting out in even greater pain. He was in another room, so they couldn't see him, but they could hear him through an intercom system. He seemed to be banging on the walls and saying things like, let me out, stop. And again, the person who was delivering the shocks would be inevitably looking to the experimenter and saying, come on, man, this guy's in pain, we got to stop. And the experimenter would keep going with this script of saying, the experiment demands that you continue, please continue. And there'd even be a point as the shocks were getting apparently stronger and stronger where the learner, the dude in the other room, was saying, my heart, and there was a point at which, and this is especially discomforting for the folks who were delivering the apparent shocks, when if they even got this far, the guy in the other room, the learner, stopped responding at all, was no longer even crying out in pain, and all they would hear was silence from the other room, and yet the experimenter was still saying, please continue. If he's not responding in any way, it counts as a wrong answer. You got to keep delivering the next shock. So anyway, what Milgram was doing throughout this very elaborate setup was he was essentially testing the participants, the teacher, to see, at what point would they just stop? At what point would they be like, screw it, no, you're telling me to keep going, but screw you, man, I'm gonna stop. And of course, a lot of participants did stop. And the remarkable thing, and this is the thing that that always shows up in the textbooks, is that actually the majority of participants didn't stop; they kept going. Pretty much all the way to to where they couldn't go any further. And so now there was a lot of variations. It turns out there's a lot of different variables that affect the extent to which people do stop earlier versus later. But the thing, one of the really meaty take-home messages, and the thing that is always driven home in the way this work is presented in psychology textbooks is essentially this. We as human beings would like to think that we're not going to do something that hurts somebody else, and we might be inclined to not do stuff that hurts other folks. But if somebody who is in a credible position of authority is telling us to do it and is persistent in telling us to do it, we find it very hard to defy that authority figure, and we will obey that authority figure even if it involves doing this thing that just feels wrong to us. And that's a pretty profound finding. But I actually think it's way more profound than that, because the way that's presented is essentially just saying, you know what? People are inclined to obey authority figures, which is interesting enough. But the reason I think it really is a profound finding in terms of what it reveals about human nature is because, and this is the way that Milgram talked about it in a book that he wrote about it. And it's and I've always felt like, this part doesn't get enough play in textbooks. I'm going to go off script here. I'm sure you'll edit this out, but I'm just curious. You've written multiple textbooks. You've written an intro text, and you've written a social psychology text, and you cover Milgram in both those. I've pretty much probably told the story that your textbooks tell. I'm about to go deeper than that. There's a really important part of these studies that it can't come across in a textbook, in a written summary of it very well. It comes across nicely in this little film that Milgram made about the studies, where he actually filmed the participants who were actually doing this, the participants who were obeying the authority figure, which is this: they found it difficult to do. They weren't just saying, okay, you're saying I should do this, I'll do it. They were protesting. I mean, they were clearly like feeling super anxious about the thing because there was this guy who they were apparently causing pain to, and there was this other guy, the experimenter, who was saying, keep doing that. And that, I think, is the fact that they were getting these two opposing signals, a guy calling out in pain and saying, essentially, stop shocking me, and another guy who was calmly telling them, another guy who, was a credible authority figure who was telling them, keep doing that. It was that thing, the juxtaposition of these two opposing signals that was causing them, the participants, not just to obey, because they weren't always obeying, sometimes they were not obeying, but causing them to feel this intense conflict. And this is the way that Milgram talks about it, and I think this is the deeper and more profound thing, because what the experiments are showing, particularly as manifested in the stressful response that participants found themselves in, it's really not simply a set of experiments on obedience to authority. It's an experiment on norm conflict and how people respond psychologically when these two normative expectations come in is kind of rare. These two normative expectations come into direct conflict with each other. There's a powerful social norm that tells us, don't hurt people. Be good to other people. Be cooperative with other people. Don't do things that hurt them. There's another powerful social norm that says, people who have some higher status than you, or some authority over you, or some greater expertise than you, or greater prestige than you, if they advise you to do something, you ought to do it. And these two norms are super powerful norms. I mean, the norm of, don't hurt people gets instantiated in just about every culture in a lot of different ways. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, et cetera, et cetera. And the norm of, obeying somebody who has some authority, people grow up with that. They grow up with authority figures, their parents, advising them on what to do and not to do, and those kids generally do what those parents advise them to do and not to do. And if they don't, that has pretty negative consequences, because generally speaking, let's face it, kids don't really know how to survive very well in the world. They depend upon these authority figures providing them that guidance. And then as kids grow up and become adults, there's we're more likely to actually survive and reproduce and so forth if we follow the advice of people who have the esteem of others, if they have been endowed by others with the credentials of an authority figure. So there's really powerful evolutionary reasons as to why there is a norm that exists in just about every culture to be cooperative with other folks in our culture, to be good to those other folks, to not hurt them. There's also very powerful evolutionary reasons underlying this other norm that exists in virtually every culture to attend to the guidance provided by authority figures. And so these are among the most universal norms that you see in all human cultures, and they're very powerful norms. Most of the time, we don't even really think about it because they don't come into conflict. And so what Milgram's studies revealed is that when you have these powerful norms that, in this rare circumstance, are actually not lining up, we're kind of caught in the middle, and that's incredibly distressing because now we have to choose, any course of action. I stop shocking the guy, I'm violating a super important norm. Or I obey the authority figure, I'm also violating a super important norm. So it's an incredibly profound example of the power of social norms that shape how we interact with people in our communities, interact with our environment more broadly. And it's a powerful illustration of two norms in particular that are, just profoundly important in our human nature. Norms governing our cooperative interactions with others, norms governing how people interact with and are expected to interact with other folks who may have different roles within a kind of a hierarchical system. And it's that stuff that gets left out if people simply talk about it as an experiment on obedience to authority. It's so much more than that. It is really a peek into something that really defines human nature, which is, I'm not sure how to say it as profoundly as I feel it, but it's something about the power of social norms and the importance of social norms in guiding how we think and feel and interact with other folks, and the necessity of social norms to actually inform us as how to survive and to thrive.